Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. Wherever you are in the world today, now you're at the new way, where we take everything we thought we knew and weigh it again, just in case. And so today my guest is going to be analog, but I'm actually going to be the guest on his show. And so I'm going to bring him in, hand him the screen, and we'll see where it goes from there.
Howdy. Good morning.
Morning, Ben. How are you today?
Great. Excited for this conversation.
Okay, excellent. As we were talking just before this, I raised a question concerning some work that you talked about in your last episode, and another guy on the internet named Archaix has talked about in his episode. And I'm trying to figure out the chemistry of how it works. At one point in the history of humanity, there was a phase of air known as the vapor canopy. And to me, when vapor implies liquid and canopy applies above, I tend to wonder if that's continuous rain or just a humidity near 100%, or how it might work. So Ben has some answers for me. I guess we'll start the conversation there and then roll back into some history that sets up some chemistry.
Yeah. Great way to start the conversation. Yeah, people hear the name Archaix, and he's taken this concept and really rolled with it. My opinions vary a little bit, but of course, come to find, it was quite an interesting theory that was explaining a lot of oddities that scientists were finding in the early 1900s, late 1800s. Actually, the earliest mentioning of it began in about the 1870s when they first started mining in Alaska. And a scientist came to the theory that there was a ring, that the largest quantities of gold existed in this ring of a certain latitude, of which Alaska was part of. And his theory was that this canopy existed, and you could think of it like a high humidity, but I kind of use the idea of a rainforest, and that a physical barrier keeps a huge amount of vapor in this kind of set altitude. And I've gone as far as to say that the proverbial falling of the ancient trees described in Enoch was related to this vapor canopy and the fall of the vapor canopy. I've done a few videos on this. I think I've done 3 or 4 now. And the gold and the off air we were talking about the mammoths. Not just mammoths, they actually find all kinds of animals. But the only animals that have really transcended or found their way into kind of the mythos of today is the woolly mammoth. But through my exploration, they've found giant lizards. So again, this kind of blows a hole in the whole thing, that you have tropical cold-blooded creatures in the northern latitudes. In fact, alongside the woolly mammoth, they found 100-foot long or larger reptiles frozen in ice as well, not just woolly mammoths. And along with that, which some people are familiar with, they found several elephants. The largest woolly mammoth graveyard in the world is in Alaska. where it looks like all these mammoths got kind of washed into this gully. And they found that several of them still had food in their mouth and food in their stomachs. And a lot of this food was of a tropical variety. And for anyone out there who's familiar with my Anomalous America series, I've almost shown in every single state that if you go far enough down, you'll find petrified tropical evidence of an age fairly recent, where all of North America had the same type of foliage and of a tropical variety and of a much larger size. I've found petrified standing forests in almost all states from Alaska to the Mississippi River. And they also are of an extraordinary size. So, along with this vapor canopy, I do believe that things were larger in this age, and that the fall of this vapor canopy is related to.
I have another idea.
Yeah, please jump in.
Maybe the Earth was smaller, and this
I
was
love
a growth
expanding.
spurt.
I love expanding Earth theory for sure.
Because if you think about it, PV equals nRT. Pressure times volume equals the number of molecules present in the air canopy times R, which is called the ideal gas constant, and is one of those insane things that science makes up to get the equations to balance.
Mhm.
And T is temperature. So pressure and volume and temperature are all related. We have evidence that the temperature dropped hugely. What happened was the pressure went up and the volume expanded.
Mhm.
And so if the pressure went up and the volume expanded, maybe teenage Earth was growing to young adult Earth.
Yeah,
Because we've
yeah.
talked
I like
about
the
it
terrarium
before.
theory. See, that's the thing that's really interesting for me too, is that you can kind of explain both of those principles essentially. That there is a possibility that the trees created again not only a different pressurization, but a completely almost enclosed system. Many old cultures have their mythos existing in a time where there were no stars and there was no sun and no moon. They called it the age of perpetual light, and these overlay quite substantially with the idea of Eden, and that Eden, this age of innocence and abundance, right, where there was no scarcity, no war, correlates nicely with the idea of this. That you know, Edgar Casey, who I love and I reference a lot, he describes this age and relates it to Atlantis, and he says that man was united across the world against giant animals. And my fossil evidence that ties in nicely again with this vapor canopy concept and giant animals, as well as large people, giant people, they all seem to overlap, and they come quite a lot closer to our timeline than the mainstream is telling us.
Well, I'm guessing that we can throw away the mainstream's timeline because it doesn't even hold back through my lifetime, and I'm 65.
Yeah.
I think there was a major shift immediately after World War II
Mm-hmm.
in that area, that things were not really happening right. It was just after war. They had to decide how to frame the war so that we, the people, we, the peepholes, might accept the vision that they were going to roll out to us. So first, we won the war, except Germany really won it. And now you're seeing the fall of the German Nazi Empire as represented by Bush, the thuggery of Obama, which really represents the mob. And we have history created for us. And since it's brought into our living rooms, we're believing it. I'm sorry. I read people like Royal Rife and Walter Russell, and they had a different science than the deck we're playing with, which was created by the university system right out of the box.
Yeah.
I mean, I have a PhD in chemistry from Oregon State University. I
Yep.
know you know the place well.
Very well, yep.
And the idea is that I've applied chemistry in general to everything in my way of looking at things. So I can take what you're saying about the canopy and come up with a mechanism of how it could. And
Yeah.
so if the Earth expands, the temperature drops from, say, tropical 310 degrees Kelvin
Yeah.
to, holy shit, I wonder if our life can live. That
Yeah.
might be a 75, 80 degree drop instantly.
Yeah, and it also, I think that does cover a lot of ground too, is because that kind of explains how, not only the instant icing, because you would need the temperature drops were varied right along the equator. They dropped, I think it was like 5 to 10 degrees, maybe a little bit less. But at the poles or the outer extremes, however you describe your Earth shape, the fall in temperature was drastic. 100 degrees or more, 200 degrees, 250, 300 degrees.
And we can measure how much small Earth was by holding pressure as a constant and figuring out what that temperature drop was.
Yeah.
And then when we know what the volume change was, we can use the calculation PV equals nRT and figure out the pressure change.
Yeah.
Because it was pressure and temperature. Well, pressure and temperature have a different relationship. So let's say it was an extremely low pressure on Earth with a vapor canopy.
Yeah.
And that way water
definitely.
molecules could hang in the air.
Yep. Pressure was huge because
right.
your constant you're describing is also directly related to the size of animals and humans.
It is, because on a smaller Earth, the volume being the same of the animal, it would balance the mass. When the Earth grew, the animals didn't. So you can imagine how big they were. They might even make Mount go.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and shout out Stellium. He's a friend of both of ours. And for anyone that doesn't know what Lenny's referencing, we're talking about Mount Go and Stellium 7. If you've watched my channel, I've had many discussions with him, as has Lenny. And Mount Go is a mountain right outside his back door that he's done an incredible series on, revealing the Titan, showing that this is very much likely a giant mammoth, this mountain. And it's I can't remember, 2-3 miles long, something like that.
Yeah, and Stellium has a lot of stuff that is supporting evidence for a phase change between the biology of the small volume Earth and the chemistry of this volume Earth.
Yeah.
Because he has shown in different videos how the quartz and the structure of the Earth looks exactly like the inner structure of a tree.
Oh, yeah.
And recently he had one in which the salt in a cave that had been mined, the inside of the mine looked exactly like a tree.
Oh, yeah.
Now this is going to provide us with some new evidence, because organic chemistry and inorganic chemistry do not work the same way. And trees going to quartz is likely a cold fusion, a bio-cold fusion between water and carbon structure that undergoes a bunch of oxidation reduction and ends up as coke, coal, and carbon just C, like in the periodic table.
Yeah.
Activated charcoal is like the best filtering agent for anything. If you take your water and pour it through just a thin layer of activated charcoal and then a sand filter so that you don't have charcoal in your water, just those two things alone will take out all the biochemistry, all the debris, a lot of the chemicals. See, inorganic is a game of salts and charges and electrochemistry, like the magnetic universe theory.
Yeah, I think salt is an often overlooked mineral.
And it likely got into the minds at the same flash freezing event because the water with salt, the ocean, froze. And instead of waiting till it melted for the water to escape, it did a process called sublimation. Sublimation is when a solid goes to the gas without coming in the liquid phase, and it requires certain characteristics of PV equals nRT to work. But this is a once in a lifetime event.
Yeah.
And that's a key word too, because that tells us that time doesn't work that way. If there was time and the time took a lot of time, but it only seemed like a day to the people looking at time. But if it's normalized to human scale, it becomes 80 years from what we humans see, and that happened in a day.
Yeah.
So instant petrification might take 200,000 years, but it happens in a microsecond in a world at different scale. And so the idea of how scales work, they have scales. Let's say a scale is a power of 10. Okay? Human scale, one human is 1 on a power of 10 scale. So if you go up bigger than a human, you might get societies, small communities, big cities, and other things that grow from a small population following Fibonacci growth because it's nature, not human counting. So the idea that nature operates on Fibonacci starts the count at 1 and then goes to 1. And so on the one hand, you've got human scale, you, me, the people in the chat room. On the other hand, you have the collection of all humans, which they tell us is 8 billion. And I have to say poppycock on that number. Ain't nowhere close. Especially when you take the things running around in human form and consider that they're not really human. But you have to suspend your disbelief, which you and I have both learned how to do, and take it at face value until you can make a judgment. And once you can make a judgment, true or false, you can put it into your category and go on and do things, whether it works or whether it doesn't work.
Yeah.
And
it takes a lot of footwork, and you have to investigate a lot to even kind of build, an image of what these ages were like. And I think time is definitely not linear necessarily, especially in the way that we think of it today. And
yes,
consciousness plays a tremendous role in time and how we, not only how we look at time, but how time affects us. And
can I suggest that consciousness is a function of water?
Yeah,
And it
absolutely.
has nothing to do with the organic structure in which the brain serves as a supercomputer, but gives them the mass that is the carbon structure that I consider the scaffolding. The chemistry itself is a combination of both inorganic one and organic one. And when you're a supreme being, like each of us are, and all of us together are, we create a consensus reality that establishes a narrative for a timeline. Now that narrative moves from, instead of one human scale, one all humans scale, which are the two ones that are the limits in calculus.
Yeah.
So you can call one minus one and one plus one because symmetry in the universe holds. And so now that we've got both our ones figured out, our personal basis and our group consensus narrative, now we can go out and meet somebody and be a group of two, Ben and Lenny sitting here on YouTube talking.
Hmm.
And when we're done with this conversation, we're going to go back to being two groups of one, but we don't know which scale you're on and which scale I'm on because we have different missions in life, and our missions in life are graded by the scale that we find ourselves on. If anybody has read the book Anathem by Neil Stevenson, it's created in a mathic universe, and you can look at the fences around the buildings as units of time scale. And so they have the 1 year gate, the 10-year gate, the 100-year gate, and the 1,000-year gate. And these gates open once every that period of time. And so people in the 10-year gate, the decaders, don't ever get to see a thousander except once every 1,000 years when the gate opens and they have 7 days of party, and then you have to choose which gate you're going to get behind. So if you are a young person, 12, 15 years old, and you happen to be in the right year when the 100 gate opens, you can get in with a group of people on a different time frame who go through the same narrative. And since it's normalized to human scale, you don't know they're on a greater time frame. I'm implying a lot into Stevenson's work right now. He did not write it that way, but I'm sure he wrote it that way.
Yeah.
So if you take the concept of scale beyond human scale, that's 1,000 or 0.001, depending on whether you're going up or down. Notice how we get to decimals and not negative numbers. Negative numbers is a mathematical superimposition, which is using symmetry to get things right. And symmetry is part of group theory, and group theory is my area of chemistry, which I'm applying to sociology of the world, because right now we need badly a different system of the world. We're in a system of the world where Leibniz and Newton
Hmm.
in 1700 area both independently came up with calculus. Now, how likely is that two different individuals, half a continent away from each other, Leibniz in Germany and Newton in England, worked out the same concept of higher mathematics? It must have been a Fibonacci jump. And so at a Fibonacci jump, you reset the size of the group to 1, and now you go and figure out what the scale of your other 1 is. So if we've got a group that resets at 8, that means that 8 becomes 1, and 13 becomes 1, and 21 acts as 2, 34 acts as 3, and
Okay.
55 is a group of 5. And so that's a second order human scale, where we're on first order human scale. The game I started in 2001 with the creation of the Oregon Natural Resources Research Institute, ONRI, at the zoo, the wildlife safari in, it's outside of Roseburg, Winston, Pennsylvania. And I was working at the zoo developing programs. And this was before I even knew about sacred geometry or Fibonacci counting or things like that. But I had worked my way in a chemistry job where I was responsible for closing a mine. And I got paid very well and had all my time to myself because I was busy moving lab equipment from a mine that closed at NAFTA and GATT out to Canada, because it was a Canadian firm that left the country because the economic rules had changed, penalizing people who actually do work. Plot of Atlas Shrugged, Ayn Rand. Another book that's a basis set for things. Foundation, Isaac Asimov, is a basis set for things. Stranger in a Strange Land is a Heinlein basic book for things. There's also evil books. Look at any of H.G. Wells's books, especially his 2-volume history that set the current narrative.
Yeah. Atlas Shrugged is a very interesting book, to say the least, and her affiliation with, I think it was Nelson. I think it was Nelson Rockefeller.
It could be.
She was, she was a mistress to one of the Rockefellers. I'm spacing the name, but
I am not surprised. She was also a Russian, and this was when, look at World War II. Which country won the war?
I mean,
Russia.
Yeah, but and the Germans.
No, the Germans didn't really win the war.
Well, we'll get into that maybe a little bit more in this episode of what I think really happened. But
actually, I think we ought to go back to geology and chemistry and get off my tangent of time right now, because I can talk time for hours on end on how I think it works.
Yeah.
But the key is normalizing the human.
Oh, I really love the water analogy that you started that thought with, and it's a great synopsis for the human body, and you can define the age of a person by water, and all age and aging is slow, prolonged dehydration, and that the cell of the human with time, or however you want to look at it.
How about with the proper catalysts?
What do you mean?
I mean that the way we understand cell biology pretty much is organic chemistry with an underlay of an itty bitty bit of inorganic chemistry, because nature works based on the inorganic chemistry, and the organic chemistry serves as the scaffolding, but they don't want us to know that, so they've taught chemistry wrong.
Yeah, I agree.
Back when it was alchemy,
exactly,
everything had to make sense in context with everything. Sometime,
there was nothing was separate from another thing.
Yeah, sometime from the time of Walter Russell till they shifted things by force majeure in World War II times.
Yeah.
And it might not have been the war. There might have been some threat to our great grandparents that if they told anything of the old times to the new grandchildren, they would be instantly killed, and their grandchildren would be killed, and that family would die. Or something horrid like that that came out of World War One was reinforced at the end of World War Two, and we got the new frontier. Daniel Fagan, you know who he is?
I've heard the name, I believe. I'm not familiar
Lead
with the
singer is Steely Dan.
I should know that. My father was a huge Steely Dan.
Oh, your father. Yeah, if your father appreciated Steely Dan, you've got good genes.
Really quick before we get too far along, this ties in nicely again. So many of the things that we've already mentioned, and for anyone that saw my thumbnail, I had a feeling that we'd be talking about radium and timelines. And you're mentioning water, and what correlates a lot too with this vapor canopy era that we were lightly touching on was that this also was hypothesized to be Noah's flood, and that this was part of the deluge.
But one of the things they teach us is in physics, phase change takes energy, and it's totally a mistaken idea. Phase change sometimes takes energy, sometimes produces energy. And nature has a way of absorbing energy into the biological systems.
Yeah.
So maybe something happened in the phase change from liquid canopy to current solid reality that is hidden because electricity and magnetism are not right angles to each other. They're tetrahedral angles to each other. And Walter Russell knew that. And if you read the works of Walter Russell, or you go back 40 years before him and you look at James Clerk Maxwell's equations, if you want to hit an archive sometime, do a Maxwell dive right after he published Electricity and Magnetism. I'd be real interesting. That would have been 1878 or sometime around there. But the newspapers probably never talked about Maxwell, never disseminated anything that would be scientific, because the alchemists were a privileged class and the deep state decided they were going after those alchemists. It's just like when what's his name in China decided anybody who wore glasses needed to be executed. Mao Zedong.
Yeah, you can definitely see. And again, we're talking about timelines and events, and nowhere describes this, I think, in a more relatively recent term than America. How can we go from World War One, and you can step away from World War One just 50 years, and you're looking at half of the country is still a barren wasteland that has not really at all been correctly mapped or understood, and that some of the earliest French explorers, as far west as they made it, describe, as I've shown so many times, huge fortified stone cities and giant castles and all kinds of things. And in Europe in this time frame, you talk about the alchemists and the pivot of science as we know it. It's all taking place in the same time frame. History is being changed, science is being rewritten, chemistry is being rewritten. All religions are being rewritten, all languages are being rewritten. So when you talk about a transitional period and a pivot, again, for anyone in the mud flood or the kind of reset mythos, there are many more things that correlate in this, and timelines played a very important role. And as you've mentioned with the world wars, I've postulated quite endlessly that World War One is kind of it's another pivot. That you have this age of rediscovery, maybe not necessarily rediscovery, but finding of a previous pivot. This kind of your changeover event, whatever that may look like. You're describing it in terms of a Fibonacci sequence, which I like because when you look at you know pendulums and circular time, they correlate nicely, and the Fibonacci sequence is obviously a kind of a rudimentary foundation for
I
all
would suggest
life.
that we look at the Renaissance as the birth of Tartaria, and the growth spurt of the Renaissance is complete mythos, because it's the only history we carry that's not about war.
Mm. Yeah.
And so everything is funneled into that. Einstein in the 1920s might have been Shakespeare of the 1580s. When Einstein is a patent clerk, Shakespeare is a playwright.
Yeah.
Both of them are key to the transitions that take what the people commonly believe, Einstein, a patent clerk, and make him into a top scientist who, at this day and age, you say something mean about Einstein, and all these people gather around and you get disappeared and you become part of the woke agenda to stop you.
Mm-hmm.
I apologize to everybody who has the woke agenda. I'm not buying it. You can think what you want. I'm one human on one scale. I got to think what I think. And when people like Ben talk to me and can change my thinking, that's where I get the hints as to what's going on. And a lot of the theory you just heard me spew forth is putting pieces together based on new information that I'm gleaning from Ben. So, Ben, you win. I don't know what you win, but you get to be the expert in your field that I'll go to when something to me doesn't make sense and you have seen it or can see it or put a different context to it. Because I badly need the help in the new way where we take everything we knew and weigh it again. In being able to take something new in chemistry, I can integrate it and tell you like the PV equals nRT stuff. Because once you explain the vapor canopy, it was obvious to me that it had to be a size event. And anybody who believes that the Earth is a being, which is obvious to me that it's a being, changes form and shape at intervals. Who knows? Maybe she was 13 and that was the start of the hormone change. And so the event we're talking about was the night sweats for a girl who'd never had them before, going through a body change from 8 years old and that range to 13 years old and the 13 to 21 range. And now what's coming up here, the event Archaics is leading to, might be her going from teenage to young adult, which has more hormone changes, but more lifestyle changes. And it used to be when I was growing up, every parent wanted to send their kid to college. Now, any parent that sends their kid to college without the kid knowing what they want to do is insanely wasting their money.
Yeah,
Or
absolutely.
wasting the kids' money and the kids' future and indenturing them to the current slave system that's based on economics when it ought to be based on something like chemistry or alchemy, which was the system of the world before the argument between Leibniz and Newton. That was a semantic argument, but what happened there was you got a guy named Galileo Galilei, who was the noted astronomer of the time. And he came to the conclusion that it wasn't the sun that rotated around the earth, but the earth that rotated around the sun, and changed the paradigm.
Mm-hmm.
Well, he
Yeah,
got
Leibniz, for those listening who haven't heard that name before, probably 5 years ago or so, I became particularly interested in him and read just about everything he had published. And he was kind of this mirror of an older way of thinking and a transition into a kind of a newer way of thinking. He was very much an alchemist, essentially. A kind of secret alchemist in a way, but he still talked very much about transmutation and that all elements contain with all other elements basically within themselves, and that transmutation exists on a very simple scale, and that we make it far more complicated than it is. And the whole kind of philosopher's stone mythos is based largely on some kind of huge unachievable reality when nature is the philosopher's stone, as you kind of mentioned, and that nature transmutes all things on at an infinitum. And yeah, Leibniz is amazing.
You see, Newton's
before
dilemma.
Before we get too far,
Okay.
I have a relatively short article that I could just read from really quick about Alaska, and this is from the early 1900s, and it kind of gives a good overview. It talks about the vapor canopy and what some different scientists were describing in the early 1900s and why they came to this kind of unanimous. So before the term vapor canopy existed, there was a term called the annular system, and it was a kind of way of keeping time, and it related very much so when you look at the old adage. And since Lenny stepped away, I'll jump into this. But it correlates nicely with an era where people described that there was no timekeeping, didn't exist as we think of it from the stars and the setting of the sun and moon and days and stuff like that. And the annular system correlates nicely to this perpetual light era. So I'll read this article for anyone who's followed me in depth. This will be, and Lenny's got to put it on screen. So I'm going to get started, and when he gets back, he can put it up on the stream. But this is an article written in the early 1900s, 1913 to be exact. It's titled, "Was the Golden Land of Ophir in Frozen Alaska?" Isaac N. Vail, the geologist of Pasadena, California, in a new pamphlet seeks to prove that King Solomon's land of Ophir in the Bible was really in Alaska. Mr. Vail has attracted widespread attention by his many scientific explanations of pulsating Bible statements. Would you post my shared screen down there so people can follow along as I read? Thank you. Surprise has often been expressed at the enormous quantities of gold and silver obtained from Ophir by the Hebrew kings. David alone obtained from it 100,000 talents of gold and 1,000 of silver, and 1,000,000 of silver. Mr. Vail recently expounded his theory that the earth formerly possessed a ring formed of water vapor, similar to that possessed by Saturn now. This ring, spreading over a large part of the Earth, produced a tropical climate in the polar regions, hence the recent existence of mammoths and other animals requiring a hot climate in Siberia and Alaska. The fall of the water canopy caused the glacial period in the northern and southern hemispheres. Now, I've shown through some of my countless posts over the years that there was a huge population of camels in Siberia not very long ago. So this fall of the vapor canopy I've postulated is far closer to our timeline than we're told. I cannot see how a world can become tropical even up to the poles, says Mr. Vale, without the aid of a great telluric vapor shell acting as a greenhouse world roof. Such vapor roofs must fall and end tropic scenes, and, as we see, tropic conditions ended repeatedly as the ages have gone by. I take by a small additional step when I insist that a canopy, another and perhaps the last the earth ever saw, produced the Edenic and antediluvian age, and falling, closed it with a great deluge, later by a vast increase of polar snows. I think we have the strongest proof that long after the flood, even down to the birth of Christ, a stupendous mass of world vapors, a canopy of snow clouds, hung over the North world. They are alluded to in the legendary thought of every people, and far down in time when a German epic, the Nibel Ungenlied, I'm going to mutilate that, was penned. The memory of the North world. So I delved into this and I discussed this a little bit in some of my videos. This is that annular system where the stars and the moon and the reckoning of time had nothing to do with the stars. And I think it correlates nicely with this vapor canopy that they weren't even able to see the stars. And it was kind of the perpetual light. This kind of exists in the same mythos, and they've kind of messed with these stories a little bit when they talk about, winter and summer seasons in the northern latitudes where the sun disappears for many months on end. But this isn't what they mean. And in this story, it's all the time. And the moon and the sun were birthed after some cataclysm. The work in its name, The Cloud Drama, or The Song of the Cloud. About this time, also the work of Snorri Sturluson, called the Helmarkringla, The Ring's Home, or Circle's Home, was penned in Iceland, or Scandinavia, and abounds in canopy memorials. Mr. Vale argues that the water belt fell in polar regions and thereby produced a great accumulation of ice and snow. With the water fell large quantities of gold, which is always found in polar regions. Hence, the land of Ophir must have been in such a region. Here is the learned geologist's argument on the point. Hast thou entered into the treasures of the snow, or hast thou seen the treasuries of the hail, which I have reserved against the time of trouble, against the day of battle and war? There can be no fuller or stronger testimony than this from the 38th chapter of Job. The man who originally penned this passage was familiar with the fact that snow and ice contained treasure. When and how did he get this information? There are no two ways about it. Man, 4,000 years ago or more, somehow came to know that gold was hidden treasure in the snow and hail and ice, and had fallen from the skies. He got that information by gathering it from ancient snowbanks and glaciers, either at first hand in the days of Job, or the information had come down to the day from men who went to frozen north. It matters not which way the penman got it. It is enough to know he got it. So I'll just stop there. But essentially, that was a good synopsis. And it goes on to further explain that the canopies are related to this gentleman's opinion that the annular timekeeping system was the vapor canopy system, and that the gold of the polar regions is very much associated with this. And in my Anomalous America Alaska episode, I discuss a specific secret society built by gold miners that was established first in Washington, but basically on their way to the gold mines of Alaska, which they would eventually.
I learned how to assay gold.
Pardon me?
I learned how to assay gold.
What does that mean?
That means that if you bring me ore, I can crush it down, and I know the sequence of temperatures, the crucibles, the fluxes, and the different things that go into determining how much metal is in the ore. Mm-hmm. And gold usually co-deposits with silver and the platinum group metals. Mm-hmm. And so if you know how to separate your metals, well, that's metallurgy. Mm-hmm. And metallurgy does not exist in the world today. It got folded into chemistry, and the secrets belong to the mining companies.
Of
And
course.
none of the mining companies are in the U.S. anymore because the U.S. shut down all their mines. And I conjecture that that was one of those, well, we'll just use up everyone else's resources while they give it to us because we control the financial system type of
Yeah,
stuff.
absolutely. Yeah,
And
Obama does the same thing with oil and gas.
yeah, and it's straight out of the playbook. What we can do at a grassroots level relies on staying underneath the radar screen with our groups that we involved in personally. But as you go up in group size, what you find following Fibonacci is that you need those resets in order to reorganize the entity. Because what works for you as a group of one does not work in a third order group when the group of one is actually represented by 3 people or 5 people.
Yeah.
And the idea of a group of one has to be revisited every time we reach a Fibonacci advance.
hmm
So, in my personal game of existence, started back when I started Henri and could call myself an Henri scientist, is that my goal in this current period is, I think it's 377, 144 plus 233. And the new game that I am starting will then have a goal of 610. But I just had to reset from second order games to third order games. So I'm personally working on a group of one at a different scale, a third order game. But by the time you do the math, you realize that there's 8 orders to the game. And so I have an 8x8 calendar. And if we figure out a way to distribute this calendar so that we're no longer weak, but we're strong, we use 8-day periods that are symmetrical instead of 7-day periods that are made to disrupt everybody. You
hmm
got to point a finger at Henry Ford and the Ford Motor Company back in the 1920s for implementing people on clocks for work, because that changed the paradigm as much as anything. And
Yeah.
now everybody is a slave to their profession in their working life to barely pay for things that ought to be free and clear. Everyone ought to be housed, fed, entertained, and educated, and given the freedom to mess up all by themselves. But I don't think we have free will. And the reason we don't have free will is because we don't have good information. So we better look at our information streams. And who better to do that than us while we're staying under the radar screen?
Yeah. Yeah. I think part of the whole uh, transition mentally has a lot to do with the kind of like holding yourself accountable as far as like the information that you receive and where you find it, and that you're just even looking for it really. Um, you know, when we talk about culture and things that we see going on in the world, it seems like the majority of the population is too scared to even, ask the real questions and go out and look for information themselves or find their own truths or whatever that may look like. But it's all individualized, and it's definitely been lost. And yeah, I think the work week and the language used to describe an employee is very much um, kind of bondage related. And the whole assembly plant um, kind of robotic nature that went along with those, what Henry Ford first envisioned for the assembly plant and the assembly line worker. You couldn't have had World War One without Henry Ford and his um basically what kind of workforce standardized kind of foundations that he established. I mean, you look at all the wartime efforts; they were all based on his assembly line and
Yeah.
mechanization structures. And but yeah, Henry
Along,
Ford, he's an interesting character, and he ties
yep.
in a lot with what I talk about, kind of what we talk about. And
Along the same lines of what Henry Ford was doing is Mark Zuckerberg and what's going on
yeah,
with
that's a
him
good
and
relation.
Musk in the social media control.
Yeah, yeah,
Because in reality, IRL, internet or IRC, Internet Relay Chat in the 1980s
hmm
was where, as a graduate student, I was in touch with most universities around the planet.
hmm
And while I was doing my research,
yeah.
I
I
was
was using
sitting
IRC in
I
the
was sitting in
early days.
IRC talking to people and playing games and learning how things worked.
hmm
Now the internet is the IRC and it doesn't have the functionality. In fact, they've been removing functionality from the society ever since they decided to bury people. And you'll notice that the people I came up with, Buckminster Fuller, Linus Pauling, you don't ever hear about them right now. Who do you hear about from the 50s? Um, Actors.
Yeah.
Actors replaced scientists as the people who were important. Okay, here's the next one.
Um. Well, so to kind of finish up the vapor idea, I didn't want to read the whole article for the sake of time, but I hope people are familiar with maybe some of your listeners that haven't seen any of my material. Kind of a plug my YouTube channel. I have a
Please
series
do.
called Anomalous America where I go from Alaska. Think I'm on my 12th state now. Arkansas is my next state. Um,
You're going to do Oregon again?
um, I'm going to do all the states, and then I actually plan on doing kind of like a round two where I'll pick a specific topic that I love from each state. But Oregon, as you know, both of us had called Oregon home for many years. Um, is an amazing place, and like any state in the U.S., you're so confined to, you just made the Henry Ford reference. You're so confined to the region that you're in and this city and your work week and school. It's amazing how few people even get out and see their whole state, let alone the U.S., their whole country.
Or
And
even their home community at this point? How many
yeah,
people
or
can
home
get off their
community.
screen and walk around a block?
Yeah, it gets smaller and smaller as time goes on. It's
Let
funny
me
how
make let me make
we
a
were talking about.
pertinent announcement.
Yeah,
I intend to winter in Oregon this year.
interesting.
Probably somewhere in the Grants Pass to Roseburg area
hmm
because I can't handle big cities. But I'm going to be working with Dr. Richard Allen Miller on coming out with a book on mathematics written in the 1960s that will change the way people think about numbers.
Mm.
Its working title is Numerology, but we need to come up with brand new versions of the past when it still worked the way it was supposed to work,
Mm.
because the level of reality in the current reality, spell real REEL and realize it's all a Hollywood production.
Hmm.
And the
Yeah,
writers are on strike.
yeah, yeah. So funny that secret society that I mentioned is called the Arctic Brotherhood, and it was established by all the men that ran the gold mines in Alaska. And they called themselves the Arctic Brotherhood, but they later transitioned their name into the Brotherhood of Aries, or they called themselves the Aries or the Brotherhood of Jupiter. They were actually the foundations of cinema in America. So when these men went to Alaska, took over the gold mines, became incredibly rich, they came back to Seattle, Tacoma, and later on Hollywood, and they started the Actors Guild and all of these things. So it's quite an interesting correlation that you have the Arctic Brotherhood, who basically said that whatever we find up there, we're going to keep secret. And, just what I was able to uncover through newspapers about Alaska and what people were finding there is mind blowing. So again, for any of your listeners who aren't familiar with my work, I would start in Anomalous America, episode 1, Alaska, and it'll blow your mind, the things they found up there. It definitely shows very strongly that you had a gigantic population of millions, if not, hundreds of millions of people living in the northern regions. And Alaska was incredibly populated. The entire Aleutian chain was densely populated, and all of Alaska was populated. Grecian cities, stone roads, thousands of Etruscan type tombs, giant creatures, giant lizards, giant animals. But what I was getting there too, and since I kind of titled this timelines and related this to radium, we were discussing a little bit. We glossed over the giant tree relation and how I showed how, in my opinion, that this is related to the canopy. So really quick, I just wanted to show this. This is Velebit Mountain Cave System. It's one of those spelunking capitals of the world. Here's one of the interior chambers, veins as they call them. Here's what the mountain looks like. And for those that are new to this information, this may be difficult to kind of wrap your mind around, and I understand. But I've looked at enough of these now, and if you compare this with, your everyday tree stump, the similarities are quite endless. But here's a map of some of the cave sites, and this has the incredibly blatant, obvious looks of a tree stump here. And when you look at the anatomy of a tree, they have these veins that extend down to water level. So you see the lake over here. These veins exist in all trees even to this day. And in fact, they go they go down even more. And when you look at some of the exploration of these caves, they're basically packed with material. So they say, oh, these probably went endlessly, perhaps another 1,000, 2,000 feet into the earth. And these go into the root systems. When you compare an image like this to a mining shaft, they're almost identical. You'll find the shaft goes down, and then they have all these runners that come off horizontally, and they find, one layer will be coal, one layer will be this and that. And this is related again to, you mentioned stellium a little bit in the beginning. Me and him have talked over the years, quite endlessly about this subject, but it's until recently that he's really kind of taken the ball and ran with it. But the mining companies, as you mentioned they're all owned by these same types of people. It's all kind of a brotherhood.
Hey, let's just put it how it is right now. Everything's owned by either BlackRock or Vanguard.
Mm-hmm.
And they will merge before too long, and then the whole system will fail. We're not dealing with banks. We're not dealing with governments. We're dealing with a fictional narrative that is created to entertain the normies. And we still need to shoot down the narrative, but we need to create the beginnings of a new narrative so that there's a place to go to.
Yeah, absolutely. And why I wanted to show that reference, since we kind of just glossed over it a little bit, and again, hopefully someday we can do this again with stellium, and we can probably spend a little more time on this material. But anyone that's familiar with mine knows that I've talked endlessly about what ancient mining looked like and what it involved. And again, for those who saw my thumbnail, I titled, I related this to radium. So how does this relate? Well, radium is found in petrifactions, all kinds, predominantly trees, but it's found in all organic petrifactions. And since me and you were talking about water, and you were talking about, water has memory, and it's kind of like the foundation of life in a sense, and it's the foundation of structure as well. A lot of my work is correlated to radium and its healing properties. As you mentioned off air to me, this is something I wanted to touch on, and I just kind of picked this article because it's a good synopsis, and I have hundreds of hours of material on my channel now, and I've started a radium series, and I'm probably like 6 or 7 episodes in, and I believe I did maybe my second or third episode was radium could cure the ills of the world. So yeah, radium mining in America. We talked about the Germans in World War One, and why I kind of hinted at what happened in World War II being related to the Germans winning the war. Well, I think much of the German, you know, talk about alchemists and priests. The German army was a country built on alchemy and a priest class and this kind of old world knowledge. But fast forward, um, the Germans had strip mined all of Bohemia, Austria-Hungary, of their radium long before America even had this so-called Madame Curie identification of the element radium. It was known for 50 years before she was handed the discovery by the Standard Chemical Company, which is a Rockefeller institution. And they were buying up all of the radium mines in America in the early 1900s. In fact, several different governors, state level, were pleading with the federal government to do something about it. And they went as far as naming this conglomerate the German Syndicate, and it was owned by a trust, but it was ran by like 15 different families. Now they were strip mining the radium out of America and sending it to Germany, and I made a lot of correlations that some of the advanced submarine and blimp technology was utilizing radium. For a byproduct of radium is helium, and they had already designed by 1910 perpetual steam engines that off of a pinhead size of radium, a steam engine, could produce power endlessly. 1,000 years they estimated, and with enough water, you could stay in the air forever. Obviously, you got to feed the people and provide water. But the submarine technology was the same thing. Anyways, fast forward, take a step backwards in time. I did a few episodes about the Fountain of Youth, and that radium spring water filters through the ground. You described this when you were talking about coal and different types of filtration. Well, from the 1800s and before, these springs were sacred to just about all cultures, and they exist all across the world. And a scientist in the early 1900s, 1915, 16, was traveling the world measuring the radium, because he hypothesized, as this article is going to explain a little bit, radium in the elixir of life. He was testing water here in America and finding that these sacred hot springs, these springs that had all these healing qualities that people had been talking about, actually contained radium. And I've gone as far as to state that these radium springs are filtering through old trees, and that the springs are actually from the roots of trees and tree systems, radium being kind of a remnant of what was left in the tree. So I'll just read a little bit of this article here. Have French scientists fathomed the secret that Ponce de Leon sought in the fabled land of Bimini? Now, Bimini actually was the name of Florida, but had been mistranslated. That Lowly thought he saw in the soul of the grape, the Roger Bacon and the Paracelsus dreamed over. The restoration of youthful vigor to an aged horse through the injection of radium mean that a serum from this mysterious substance will stand revealed as the elixir of life. Analysis of the blood of this horse showed an increased number of red corpuscles and traces of the vital drug in the veins. So they even took this type of experiment to another level, and I have quite a few more articles. One of my superhuman radium videos, I talk more about this. They started injecting the blood of these horses into people, and found that the people, their hair would grow back, their strength would come in, their blood would purify. Science can make no hard promises until backed by facts, but if this bewildering mineral shall be proved to contain the essence of perpetual youth, what dreams will have come true? Through all time everlasting, youth has been the crown held aloft by the tempter as his richest talisman. The Grecian Elysium, the Valhalla of the Norseman, the happy hunting ground of the Indian, all were symbolic of the conquest of age. The search for the golden apples of the Hesperides, the effort of centuries to reduce gold to a drinkable form, the magic of alchemists, were fed by men's tragic quest for unnumbered days. But if we attain at the last this goal of mortal hope, what then? Old age, it is true, would no longer appall us, but youth would no longer charm. Time would cease to be, therefore ambition would perish. We would live for tomorrow, yet there would be no today, and would the world's progress crumble away. Be sure that the power who hid his radium in the mills and dipped us into his stream of mortality also wrote for us the all wise words, so far shalt thou go. So again, this is just one of hundreds. I go on to show more, endless really, but the correlations between radium. Here's one of my favorites. They were impregnating glass jars with radium for hundreds of years. This was very popular in Europe, Bohemia, of course, Bohemia, where the first radium mines were ever found. They found that when they impregnated glass with radium, that you could fill this with water and the water would structure. You know, you talked about Walter Russell. Radium actually, it's like easy water, essentially. We mentioned this off air with each other. But they found the radium impregnated glass not only killed bacteria, it restructured the water and made it hyperhydrate, essentially. You know how structured water, the body actually absorbs the water much easier. It doesn't reject the water, and unstructured water can pull minerals from your body and actually dehydrate you or
There
demineralize.
are many different forms of structured water.
Yeah.
And they have different properties.
Of course, yeah.
Just stirring the water counterclockwise and then turning around and stirring the water clockwise and then going back with a third counterclockwise will structure the water.
Yeah. Yeah, the vortex.
It's also important to get clean water.
Yeah, of
and
course.
Clean doesn't mean pure only water. That's distilled, and that will absorb minerals, but it's much better than people will scare you with.
Yeah,
because the minerals it absorbs are the ones that will deposit and make things icky inside your body. Yeah. Anything that's attached where it belongs will not get taken out by structured water. It's only sweeping your system. It's like a cleanse.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and like I was mentioning earlier, Walter Russell described aging as dehydration. And, you know, that when you measure, I don't know what it was. He was relating an old study, but they measured, 1,000 people, and they showed from an infant to an elderly person that they're just slowly dehydrating, that their body slowly gets less efficient at absorbing water and the minerals in it, and it gets less efficient at the water absorbing the bad minerals, and they slowly toxify. And that when 99% of the people he measured, the baby is the most hydrated, highest percentage of water, and then it gets lower and lower and lower as you go on, and you reach a threshold where you essentially pass away because you've dehydrated your body so much. And they've related this a lot to skin and wrinkles and stuff like that, and this correlates to the articles they were writing in the same time frame, like with the horse blood, but they were measuring these radium springs, and like you said, they had the underlying correlation was radium. They had many minerals, and the minerals fluctuated depending on where they were in the world. Ultimately, they said their skin would be brighter, wrinkles would disappear, the hair would grow stronger or would gain color. And yeah, um, so radium, I think, when you look at it from a chemist perspective, I'm sure there's a lot more to it. Obviously, what brought us together is newspapers, and that's kind of my niche.
Well, let us go back and look at this relationship of radium to things a little bit closer.
Yeah.
Because in chemistry, when they talk about metals, we're almost always talking about the middle of the periodic table, the
Okay.
area where you've got iron, cobalt, nickel, copper, zinc, palladium, platinum, gold, all the mercury, lead. Lead's not a metal, but people think it's a metal. Silicon's not a metal, and people think it's a metal in certain forms, but chemistry form matters. And if you have something and it's in the wrong form, it's essentially useless for what it can do.
Yeah.
It's like gold. If anybody's used Ormus gold is an orbitally rearranged monoatomic gold unit.
Mm-hmm.
And if you have Ormus gold in your system, it acts like a super catalyst.
Yep.
And it cleans you up totally.
Yeah,
if you
and
put
it
Ormus
aids
gold on
in
a
it.
burn, it unburns it.
Yeah, and it aids in growth.
And the body makes Ormus gold. The body makes a lot of elements by chemical transmutation.
Indeed.
But we're not allowed to talk about it because it can't be proven. And that's the whole missing piece in the energy equation that never balanced when I was in school.
Yeah,
Remember I said as a chemist, we need balanced equations?
You touched on this a little bit when you said that we crossed over from alchemy into chemistry, and I think that's very true. And I think this is why I read that article about the lands of Ophir in Alaska, because this author was saying that the gold was in the air, right? So I think, as you stated too, that this canopy, this high humidity tropical region, was being fed by gold, and that we were breathing in this Ormus. And
yeah, I think that what we'll find is that the chemistry in a vapor canopy and the chemistry in air are different. The electrochemical potentials of the elements are different, because they're hydrates in a vapor canopy and they're standalone units in the modern world, which is a total overlay of BS as far as I'm concerned. But you have to go through their system and understand their system and push it out at the cutting edge. And there's too much incentive to just take their money. But the money is worthless. And we're learning that. And now we're at the point where each individual can create their own life. And if they put their time into the slave labor system that we have, we're still going to have the slave labor system. But everybody who has a family needs to be playing that game, because you can't stop making money tomorrow and support your family.
Yeah, you have to, as the adage saying of Jesus, you have to be in the world, but not of it.
Yes. And so if we start in-depth questioning our own fields and having these conversations in groups of 2 or 3, a group of 4 in Fibonacci is like a group of 3. So you add a person, but you really don't get any net benefit from that additional person that a group of 3 provides. What you get is a way of getting a 2-on-2 conversation instead of a 1-on-3 conversation or a 1-on-2 conversation. Nobody ever has to be wrong.
Yeah, nobody wants to be the third wheel, right?
You're in your own world, you're you, and unless you decide to change your own paradigm, It's your paradigm. You are
Yeah.
responsible for it. If you want to take a fiction and keep it in your paradigm, then that's your problem. Your paradigm doesn't work for all of humans, which, by the way, is that other one in Fibonacci. Hey, my computer just told me that I got to plug in and it's out of juice.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to need to wind this up, but let's
Yeah,
agree to have another conversation.
definitely.
Let's
Yeah, I
see
was
if we
hoping
can
to
invite
bring up the
Stellian in.
atomic table and kind of dive a little bit more into your expertise.
Yeah,
So
I
I think
wanted to talk about alkali metals, and maybe
me
I'll
too.
stay and let my computer die and then plug it back in. But I don't have a plug where I'm at.
Yeah, no worries. Just maybe let's just do a quick synopsis and we
Okay,
can kind of give people an idea of what we're
basically,
going to talk about next episode.
yeah, alkali earth metals like barium and radium and strontium and calcium and magnesium have a 2 plus charge because they're all the way to the left of the periodic table. And in atomic orbital theory, they are called S2 shells. S squared shells is how it's written. But that S2 shell doesn't like to have its electrons, so it ditches them to make a divalent cation. And there's a lot more chemistry untold in that row of the period or that column of the periodic table. And the periodic table does not agree with the chemistry.
Oh, well, there he goes. Um, so yeah, I'll just kind of, fill in the gaps here. Dr. Lenny, for my listeners that aren't familiar with him, his PhD in chemistry. Um, he has such a fascinating way of looking at this material and the things that I've been sharing. And, you know, we've known each other for a long time, but we've never done anything together. And he's kind of tapped into the radium stuff recently and some of my other work. And, he reached out and, it'd been a long time coming. Long, long, long time ago when I did a few episodes of Radio Tartary, an older show I did on YouTube. It's kind of a co-host for some months. He hosted an episode, but I've always loved the way he looked at things. When you have someone with his background and expertise who's openly saying, I can see the faults and the breaks. Hey, there he is. I was just kind of giving people a little bit, some of my listeners, a little bit of your background and talking about what we wanted to cover in the next episode.
Yeah, I have to log off because I'm not in a place where I can talk now. There's somebody sleeping nearby.
Yeah, no problem. Of course. So yeah.
But let me thank everybody for being here. You can find me on minds.com at the Mad Doctor Time.
Mm-hmm.
And I also have a Discord channel. If anyone wants to get to me through Discord, we have ways of doing that,
Mm-hmm. And yeah, and for anyone who doesn't familiar with me, you can find me on YouTube, the Archivist 1_analog_9. And I look forward to doing this again, Lenny.
Yes, I'm sure we'll be able to. And let me thank the audience once again. It was a pleasure having you all. And we'll catch up with you again in the near future. Take care, be well, and be well.
Bye, guys.